Sarah didn't waste a moment. She called for the elders, her voice firm as she moved quickly through the village, gathering those who knew how to handle this sort of thing. Zola stood by the window, her small hands pressed against the glass, watching her mother and the men of the village approach the lion. Fear still gripped her, but she couldn't help but feel a strange pull in her chest. She felt as if something beyond the lion's appearance was about to unfold. The lion didn't move. It just sat there, as if it had been waiting for them all along. The men of the village gathered around it, whispering among themselves. Zola saw Kofi, the eldest elder, take the first step forward. His face was as steady as the rock he had lived by all his life, but his eyes, those eyes, spoke a different language, one that said he wasn't afraid. Kofi knew the power of the wild, knew that fear could be as deadly as any predator. Zola's father, David, stood behind him, his hand clenched around a spear, but his face was softer than Zola had ever seen it. He wasn't holding the spear with the intent to kill. No, there was no anger in his eyes, only caution, like he was standing before something sacred. The lion finally blinked, its gaze shifting from Kofi to David. For a long moment it seemed to measure them, its body still, but its presence enormous. Sarah, ever the voice of reason, stepped forward, speaking in a voice Zola had never heard before, calm, commanding, full of quiet strength. "It's not here to harm us," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "We have to help it." Zola felt her stomach twist at her mother's words. Help it? How could they help a lion? Her father, his face torn between fear and compassion, looked at Sarah for guidance. Kofi nodded slowly, his weathered face unreadable. "We can't kill it. It's hurt. Look at its legs." And that's when Zola saw it. The lion's legs were wounded. The gashes were deep, jagged, and raw, as though it had been running for days with no rest. The realization hit Zola like a stone, and Zola's heart hammered as she watched her mother, Sarah, move with purpose towards the lion, her steps calm yet determined. It wasn't the reaction Zola had expected. She had imagined panic, maybe even a hurried retreat, but instead her mother stepped forward with an odd sense of familiarity, as if she knew what needed to be done. David followed behind her, his face tight with worry, the grip on his spear tightening as they neared the lion. Zola's legs felt heavy, her body unable to move as she watched the scene unfold before her. The lion didn't move, didn't growl or show signs of aggression. It simply sat, its golden mane matted with dirt, and its deep amber eyes fixed on Sarah and the others. It was as if it understood the gravity of the situation. Something was wrong, but there was no immediate threat. Zola's breath hitched. What was the lion thinking? Her mother reached the lion first, pausing just a few feet away. Zola couldn't see her face, but she knew her mother was taking in the full scope of what lay before them. Sarah's eyes softened with understanding, not fear. Slowly, she knelt, her voice gentle yet firm as she spoke to the lion, a quiet rhythm of words Zola couldn't hear. There was no hostility in her voice, only compassion. David stood beside her, uncertainty written across his face. Zola could see his hand trembling ever so slightly, his spear still in his grip but no longer raised. The fear that had gripped him moments earlier seemed to melt away, replaced with something else, a strange mix of awe and concern. "David," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hurt. It needs help." David's gaze flicked from Sarah to the lion's legs, and Zola followed his eyes. The lion's right leg was bloody and raw, the gashes deep and unmistakable. The lion's movements had slowed, and it seemed to wince with every shift of its weight. For a long moment, Zola's father didn't speak, his mind racing as he processed the situation. He looked at Kofi, who had quietly joined them, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the lion. "It's not dangerous," Kofi said quietly. his voice rough with experience. "It's wounded. We can't leave it like this." Zola's heart clenched. Her father's hesitation was palpable, but Kofi's words rang with the kind of wisdom only someone who had spent their life in the wild could possess. Slowly, David lowered the spear, the weight of his decision settling over him. Zola watched her father, unsure of what would happen next. What did it mean to help a creature like this? Could they? In that moment, something shifted in the village, something quiet but profound. The lion wasn't just an animal. It was a reflection of their own struggles, their own survival. As Sarah knelt beside the lion, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch its mane, Zola understood. Kindness didn't come from a place of safety. It came from a place of courage, from seeing the vulnerability in another and choosing to act anyway. And that was what her mother was doing now. As days passed, the villagers gathered around the lion, watching over it as it slowly recovered. The initial fear that had clung to their hearts now mingled with something else, a shared understanding. They saw the lion not as a threat, but as a symbol of something deeper, something they could not quite put into words. It wasn't just the lion that was healing. Something in the village was shifting too. The village had always been a tight-knit community, but the struggles of the past few months had pulled them into separate corners. The crops had failed, the market had dried up, and there was no real sense of hope left. People were used to surviving, but surviving didn't always feel like living. Now, as they watched this majestic creature, once feared, now embraced, become part of their lives, they began to see each other differently. Their struggles no longer felt so insurmountable when they saw the lion's quiet resilience. Zola noticed how her father, once so stern and practical, now spent hours sitting near the lion, talking to it softly, as if it could understand him. David had always kept to himself, focused on providing for his family, but now he listened more. His shoulders relaxed, his heart more open. It was as if the lion had cracked something inside of him, something that had been buried under years of hardship. Zola felt it too. At night, when the village gathered around the fire, she saw her mother smiling more, speaking less, but listening deeply to the others. There was a calmness in the air, a quiet certainty that no matter how hard things got, they could face it together. Zola's brother, Tommy, had been the most fearful of the lion at first. He would hide behind his mother's skirts, his wide eyes never leaving the creature. But as the days went on, something in him changed. He would bring the lion water, his small hands shaking but his gaze unwavering. One evening, Zola saw him sitting on a log, watching the lion from a distance. There was no fear in his eyes now, only curiosity and something deeper, an understanding. It was as if the lion had shown him something that no one had been able to teach him before. Zola spent her days beside the lion, talking to it, brushing its mane when it allowed her. She felt a connection to the lion, a connection she couldn't explain. It wasn't just about the healing of its body. It was about the way it had brought her village together. She had never seen her mother so at peace, her father so gentle, and the village so united. It was as though the lion had reminded them all of something they had forgotten, that kindness could heal, that giving without expecting anything in return could change everything. But even as the village healed, Zola couldn't shake the nagging fear that this might not last. What would happen when the lion was fully recovered? Would it leave, or would it stay? And if it left, would the peace it had brought with it stay too? She didn't know, but one thing was clear. The lion had given them something no one could take away. The lion had reminded them of the power of kindness, the power of compassion, and the strength that comes when people choose to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow souls struggling to survive. The lion's health had improved, but it still moved slowly, its steps hesitant and labored. Zola could see the pain in its eyes, the way it tried to stand but struggled, the way its body trembled with exhaustion. The villagers had done everything they could to care for it, offering food, water, and shelter. But there was more that needed to be done. The lion's wounds, though healing, had not yet fully closed. The gashes along its legs were still raw, still tender to the touch. It was Kofi, the village elder, who first suggested they take the lion to Naya, the healer from the neighboring village. At first, the villagers hesitated. Naya was an outsider, someone they rarely trusted. They were used to their own ways, to their own traditions. But Kofi's quiet wisdom convinced them. This wasn't about tradition, this was about healing, about saving the lion, about doing what was right. Nia arrived at the village with her small team of assistants. She was a woman of few words, but her presence was undeniable. She moved with the grace of someone who had seen the worst and the best of life, someone who knew the importance of compassion and care. Zola watched as Nia knelt beside the lion, her hands gentle but purposeful as she examined its wounds. There was no hesitation in Nia's touch, no fear in her eyes. She didn't see a beast, she saw a patient in need. "We need to clean the wounds properly," Nia said, her voice calm, yet full of authority. "And then we need to let it rest. Its body is exhausted, but it can heal. It just needs time." Zola's father, David, looked at her with uncertainty. He had never been one to trust outsiders, to trust someone who didn't belong to the village, but he knew in that moment that they had no other choice. The lion was part of their community now, and they had to do everything they could to help it, just as they would help each other. As Nia worked, Zola felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over her. It wasn't just the lion that needed healing. It was the village itself. Nia's presence, her willingness to help without asking for anything in return, reminded Zola of something she had forgotten. The lion wasn't the only one who needed saving. The village, struggling in silence, needed the same compassion, the same kindness. For the next few days, Naya and her team worked tirelessly, cleaning the lion's wounds and applying herbal remedies. The lion, though initially wary, began to trust them. It allowed Naya to touch its legs, to apply the medicine, to care for it in a way that made Zola's heart swell with awe. It wasn't just the healing of the lion that moved her, it was the way Nia treated the creature. She treated it as if it were no different from a human being in need. It wasn't about the danger or the fear. It was about compassion, about doing what was right, regardless of the risks. Zola watched her mother, father, and the villagers come together in ways she had never seen before. They worked alongside Nia, learning from her, sharing in the healing process. The lion's pain became their pain, and its recovery became their collective victory. There was no longer any separation between them and the creature. They had all become part of the same story. A story that was about kindness, about unity, about survival. And as Zola sat beside the lion, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breath, she understood something that would stay with her forever. Kindness, once given, can change everything. It can heal wounds, it can mend broken hearts, and it can bring even the wildest of creatures back home. The days passed, and with each one, the lion grew stronger. Its steps were no longer shaky, no longer hesitant. The once deep gashes along its legs had healed, leaving behind faint scars, reminders of the struggle it had endured. The lion no longer flinched when someone approached. It had learned to trust the villagers, learned that they meant no harm. It would lie in the sun, its golden mane glowing, while the children played nearby, always careful but always fascinated by the creature that had come into their lives. Zola watched the lion, her heart swelling with a mixture of awe and love. She had never seen anything like it before. This wild animal, once feared by all, had become a symbol of something greater. The village, too, had changed. The once fragmented relationships between families had grown stronger. People who had once kept to themselves were now helping one another, sharing resources, and coming together in a way Zola had never seen before. The lion had united them, showing them that there was strength in kindness, strength in compassion, even when times were hard. Her father, David, who had always been the quiet, steady provider, had become more open, more present. He spent more time with Zola and her brother, Tommy, teaching them the lessons of the land, showing them the beauty of the world around them. Zola had never realized how much she had missed her father's attention until now. He was no longer just a figure in the background, working tirelessly to provide. Now he was with them, teaching them, laughing with them, sharing in their joys and their worries. It was as if the lion had reminded him of what truly mattered. Family, connection, love. Even Tommy, who had once been the most afraid of the lion, had found a bond with it. Zola saw him sitting beside the lion one afternoon, his small hand resting gently on its head. The lion had nuzzled him softly, as if to reassure him that there was no danger, no fear to be had. Tomu looked up at the lion with wonder in his eyes, his once terrified gaze now replaced with admiration and affection. It was as if the lion had taught him that fear wasn't something to run from. It was something to understand, to overcome, to embrace. Zola spent more time with the lion as well, sitting beside it, talking to it. She felt a strange sense of peace when she was near it, a sense of connection that went beyond words. The lion had become more than just a symbol of survival. It had become a part of the family, a living, breathing reminder of the power of kindness. Every time it looked at her with those amber eyes, she felt a surge of gratitude, a deep understanding that kindness was not something to be taken for granted. It was a gift, a choice, and when given freely, it could heal wounds, mend hearts, and change lives. But even as the lion grew stronger, there was a part of Zola that feared the day it would leave. She couldn't shake the thought that once the lion was well enough, it would return to the wild, to the life it had known before. And with it would go the peace it had brought to their village. But even in that fear, she knew one thing for certain. The lion had already changed them. And no matter what happened next, they would carry the lessons it had taught them for the rest of their lives. The village's quiet life began to ripple outward as news of the lion spread. First, it was the neighboring villages, then distant towns. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a wounded lion being nurtured back to health, became a story that captured the hearts of many. The media arrived weeks later, drawn by the miraculous recovery and the unity the lion had inspired in the village. Zola stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the reporters with a mix of wonder and disbelief. It felt surreal to her, seeing their small village on television, seeing her family's story shared with the world. At first, the villagers were wary of the attention, unsure of how to handle the strangers with cameras who arrived every day, eager to capture a moment of hope. But as time passed, something shifted in them too. They saw the way people reacted to their story, the way it brought smiles to faces across the globe. For the first time in months, there was a glimmer of something more than just survival. There was hope. The kindness they had shown to the lion was being reflected back at them, multiplied by the world's collective compassion. Zola's mother, Sarah, was the first to speak on television. She spoke simply, her voice calm but full of conviction. "We didn't do this to be seen," she said, looking into the camera. "We did this because it was the right thing to do. The lion needed help, and we could offer it. And in the end, we all needed each other." The words resonated deeply, not just with the villagers, but with anyone who heard them. The simple truth of her statement was undeniable. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about the shared humanity in offering kindness, even when the world seemed harsh. As the media continued to cover the story, people began sending letters, gifts, and donations. The village, once struggling to get by, suddenly found itself in the midst of a wave of generosity. But even as the gifts piled up, what moved the villagers most was the outpouring of love. They received messages from people in far-off places, strangers who shared their own stories of kindness, their own struggles, and how the lion's story had given them hope. It was overwhelming, humbling, and, in many ways, healing. Zola couldn't help but feel a deep connection to these people, even though they were miles away. The world, it seemed, was capable of more love than she had ever imagined, and yet she knew that no amount of recognition or donations could change the truth. The village had already been healed. They had been given a lesson in kindness, and that was the gift that would stay with them, no matter how much the world outside had taken notice. The lion, who had once been a symbol of fear, was now a symbol of transformation. Its presence had changed the villagers, helped them see what truly mattered. And now, as the world looked at them, they understood something deeply profound. The kindness they had given freely had come back to them 1,000-fold, not in the form of money or fame, but in the form of human connection, the kind that reminded them that even in the darkest of times, love could still find its way through. The day came when the lion was fully healed, its once raw legs now strong and sure, its eyes gleaming with the quiet confidence of an animal who had regained its strength. The villagers knew this moment was coming, but no one was prepared for the weight it carried. The lion had become so much more than just an injured creature they had nursed back to health. It had become part of them, woven into the fabric of their lives in a way that no one could have imagined when it first appeared in their fields. Zola stood by the edge of the clearing, watching the lion. It was grazing now, its movements slow but graceful, almost serene. She felt a knot in her throat as she realized this was the last time she would see it here, in this place where it had found refuge. The thought that the lion would leave, returning to the wild from which it had come, felt like the end of something deeply personal. She had grown to love it, not just for the healing it had undergone, but for what it had brought to their village, what it had brought to her family. Sarah and David were standing beside her, their hands intertwined, their eyes reflecting the same sadness Zola felt. David, who had once been so distant, now seemed to understand the quiet beauty of this moment. Zola's father turned to her, his voice soft but steady. "It's time," he said. His words were simple, but they carried an unspoken truth. The lion had been a catalyst, a force that had changed them all, and now it was time for it to fulfill its purpose. The villagers gathered around, their faces somber, but their hearts full of gratitude. They knew what they had to do. It was time to let the lion go, to return it to the wild where it truly belonged. The lion had healed them as much as they had healed it. And as the villagers stood together, there was no bitterness, no regret, only the understanding that kindness, once given, had the power to transform. Zola stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out to the lion, her fingers brushing against its warm fur. It looked at her, its amber eyes filled with something she could not quite define, an understanding, a connection that needed no words. She whispered softly, her voice breaking, "Thank you." The lion lowered its head, nudging her gently with its nose, as if to say it understood. And then, with a final look at the village, the lion turned and walked toward the distant horizon, its powerful form disappearing into the tall grass. It wasn't a goodbye filled with sorrow, but one of acceptance, of completion. It had come into their lives as an unexpected visitor, but it was leaving with something more, a reminder of the strength that comes from kindness, the healing power of compassion. Zola stood there, watching the lion fade into the distance, and realized that this moment, though filled with sadness, was also a moment of victory. The lion had brought them together, had shown them that no matter how hard life became, there was always room for kindness, always room for love. It was a lesson that would stay with them forever, a lesson that Zola would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. If this story has touched you, if you believe in the power of kindness to change lives, Remember that you too can be that change. In a world that can often feel dark, the smallest act of compassion can create a ripple that touches more lives than you'll ever know. Choose kindness, always. You never know whose life you might be saving, just by being there when they need it most.